Welcome, everyone. This is a webinar on childcare and development block grant core messaging. We're really thrilled to be able to bring it to you today. The speakers on today's webinars will be Rachel Zaentz. She is the Senior Vice President with Finn Partners. Finn is the consulting firm that is working with the Center for Law and Social Policy, National Women's Law Center, and the partnership on our effort to implement the reauthorization of the Child Care and Development Block Grant and make the best use of the new funding that Congress created about a year, 15 months ago now, and also to try and get that funding renewed and increased. Also joining us today is Patricia Tennen. She is the Chief Officer of Strategic Initiatives at Kentucky Youth Advocates. They are one of the grantees in this project, and she is going to talk about some of the messaging work they've been doing in Kentucky, where they were able to get an early start on talking about the outcomes of what they're doing because their legislature passed their implementation fairly early in the process. So without more ado, I'm going to turn this over first to Rachel. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
Great. As Deb mentioned, my name is Rachel Zaentz. I work with Finn Partners, and I provide communication support to a variety of clients, all in the social impact space, with a particular focus on early childhood development and education. I work with the Pritzker Children's Initiative, the Clinton Foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and now partnering with the National Women's Law Center to help communicate the impacts of CCDBG funding. So we're going to start today with kind of a broad roadmap to guide so that you guys understand where we're starting from and what's grounding our strategic communications plans. Present and refresh everyone on some message research from the field that really grounds our messaging recommendations that we've been working on with NWLC and Deb and CLASP over the course of the last couple of months. And then we'll actually go over and break down some of that messaging and then talk about how you guys can apply that messaging and this core framework to your local efforts. So where do you start? In order to determine the most effective communication strategy, messages, and tactics that will influence policy targets, you want to start by developing a roadmap for your efforts. So the strategic communications roadmap includes establishing communications objectives which advance short, intermediate, and long-term policy goals, identifying your targets, audience segments, and the personas who we need to influence to get what we want, and then to create a core message that clearly articulates the value of CCDBG, identifying the need, so why parents, children, and providers need this, and the solution, which is increasing funding for CCDBG and federal investments in child care, all told through data and stories of impact, which we refer to as proof points here. So here you'll see our main So here you'll see some of our main communications objectives. Sorry, I'm just skipping. So actually we're going to move on first to some core audience insights. But before I talk about that, our communications objectives here are really we want to ensure policymakers understand how CCDBG supports families with young children at a particularly critical time in their development. 2, we want to amplify the impact of CCDBG funding by sharing how it's impacting the lives of children, families, and providers in states and communities. And so in terms of our key audience insight, so we have an idea of our targets for this campaign. Specifically at the National Women's Law Center, we are focusing on members of Congress and then the folks who influence them. So maybe that's decision makers in your state, parents, engaged voters. And we want to think, what do we know about our targets and audiences? What do they care about? So this is where we really will rely first and foremost on your insights on the ground. And we've been having, I think I've spoken to most of you at this point one-on-one. But also we really do want to rely on research and messaging research. And there's no shortage of messaging research in the early childhood field, especially in the last year. And in particular, we saw a lot of research that really focused on childcare and programs that impact infants and toddlers and their families. We had heard previously that there was a lot of research on pre-K and preschool, but maybe not as much on issues impacting younger children and their families. And so specifically, the findings and the insights that really ground our messaging recommendations come from a mix of research conducted by the Pritzker Family Foundation, the Bipartisan Policy Center, so Frank Luntz and his team, and then Center for American Progress. So a nice mix of bipartisan message research. So these findings, we can answer specific questions about these, but I'm just going to go in at a high level and highlight some of the key findings, and then we'll be connecting that to the messaging that we'll be presenting shortly. So one, there's a widespread belief that child care plays a key role in development. Policymakers and informed voters really recognize that the first years are absolutely critical and foundational. This was recognized across political ideologies, but it was also important not to position a child care experience as overly determinative. We don't want to make it sound like children are a lost cause if they don't get child care. The brain science, the brain science is compelling, but it's really only half the story. Brain science definitely helps us answer the why now and convey urgency, and that noting that we have a critical few years to provide children with quality early care experiences. But it's not enough to say child care experiences in the first 3 years are important. We need to really connect policy, which is in this case CCDBG, with the scientific evidence. So why does a high quality child care experience stimulate brain development? Or why does supporting them through, let's say, rate increases or increases to subsidies make them better equipped, make providers better equipped to stimulate brain development? 3, cost is a driving concern. Research from CLASP, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, shows that when I'm talking to voters, and particularly informed voters, cost is the driving concern about child care. More than half of parents and family members surveyed have had their careers negatively impacted by challenges addressing affordable, convenient, and quality care. Also, according to the Bipartisan Policy Center as well, conservatives and liberals alike perceive the cost as the primary challenge to accessing quality care. Yet, when conservatives and liberals heard that the average child care worker qualified for government assistance, they really expressed strong support for assistance programs to ensure that child care workers specifically receive and are making a living wage. And so support for increasing for child care is largely driven by costs, and then ensuring kids get proper development is the next highest driver for increasing in funding according to the CAP research. Fourth, this is about supporting parents, not replacing them. It is absolutely critical to recognize parents as a child's most important teachers and caregivers. It's really important to position child care as a resource and a support for parents at a time when they're especially in need of affordable infant and toddler care, which can be especially pricey. Unsurprisingly, government plays a role, but opinions really do span the spectrum. We want to make it clear that we are not trying to replace parents. And when it comes to government involvement, conservatives are concerned that government will teach kids values, and they don't want to be thinking of child care necessarily or formal child care settings as a place where they're learning values. Liberals, on the other hand, are concerned that government just won't be able to provide everything that government alone won't be able to provide everything that young children and their families need when it comes to child care. Policymakers also need a clear vision of what's working. So in this case, I think we're pretty lucky because we're pretty focused on a specific program, but we really need to show them what's working locally. And they're also not just interested in what's working maybe in their state, but also what's worked in other places as well. And then again, it's important to show how child care investments really relate to state and community economic development, workforce development, and really immediately and down the road. So a combination, I think, of messaging that we've seen a little bit take and gain more traction recently that really highlights the immediate impacts on workforce, combined with some of the research that the early childhood community that has been using a long time for a long time, such as Professor Heckman's research on long-term returns on investment. So going on just to now, this leads us into our discussion about messaging. So you all know what messaging is. I think we all know part of why we've all come together and for this work is really the value of consistency. So I'm not going to harp on this. I think we've seen, especially through different elections, especially last year, with how kind of on message I think the Democrats were specifically on the Affordable Care Act, really how far cohesive, consistent messaging can take us as a movement. And now more than ever, we want to think creatively, especially on the digital front, about how we're leveraging different voices to really break through the clutter, especially in Washington, to create messaging that meaningfully connects with our targets. And that can also be customized and tailored for use in your state. So I'm going to caveat this just all in saying that what we're about to present to you, our goal with this is really to provide some high-level messaging, almost a narrative, a story arc that you can then fill in and tailor and customize based on the realities of what's happening on the ground in your state. And so here you'll see, and this is kind of just messaging, this is a messaging best practice, but we know that we need to understand what our specific policy targets value in terms of childcare. What would move them to become a leader on expanding CCDBG? So maybe based on what we shared, maybe it's making it more affordable so more parents can work. That policymaker wants to attract big businesses to their state. They need a supported workforce. Or maybe that policymaker is particularly passionate about lifting up teachers, early childhood providers in their community. They might really care about making sure that everyone in their community is making a living wage, especially those who are playing a lead role in child development. And essentially, whatever the issue may be, we want to understand the top value of our target and where those values overlap with our own to create foundational messaging. And so based on the research I just went through, we know that policymakers, informed voters across the political aisle understand the importance of the early years, the development that takes place, and that also they can really relate to the challenges that parents of young children are feeling during that time. So here you'll see some core messaging building blocks. And so here you'll see kind of 4 key statements, and then we'll go a little bit more into depth here. But first, we start with a core value, well, actually multiple core values here. So high quality early childhood experiences provide children with a strong start. And we'll go more into depth on these. And then families are stressed, they want and need support. This is another core value that we extracted from that message research. And now we can go into CCDBG and what it is. CCDBG helps expand families' access to affordable, high-quality care. And then what can we do to address this? So this is what we can do to address these core issues that families are faced, that policymakers understand but may not know what to do and how to address them. And so we want to position CCDBG constantly as the solution. And why, the fourth piece here is, and why despite the increase in funding, we still need more funding. We still need a much larger federal investment in child care. And this is because a gap between what parents can afford and the actual cost of quality care continues to persist. So here, I'm not going to read this for you all, but this is where you see kind of the core message framework laid out in a narrative form with a beginning, middle, and end, which is key to good storytelling, and that's essentially what messaging is. And then I'm going to break this down for you. So here is the first universal value paired with what we'll refer to as a proof point. So high quality early childhood experiences provide children with a strong start, because research shows that a child's earliest experiences and relationships all play crucial roles in the development of their brain, as well as the foundation for all future learning, behavior, and health. And here's another important universal, I'm going to back up one. All right, so I'm just moving ahead. So this is another important universal value, which is that why do parents with young children in particular need support? So the message research showed us that policymakers really seem to understand that generally parents with young children are earlier in their careers and sometimes still pursuing post-secondary education, so they need access to childcare to go to school or progress in their job. And then I'm going to back up because my order is a little off. But then, so then here, this is how can these issues that we just talked about, so how do we make sure kids are, how do we make sure that we're taking advantage of these early years, and how can we support parents when we know that they need support at this particularly challenging time? So what's the solution? And that's CCDBG. So the recent increase in federal child care investments have allowed states to better support programs and providers. With these funds, states are helping more families afford and find high quality care. And then this is the fourth piece that we talked about, but wait, we can't stop there. We know that there was a large increase in funding for CCDBG last year, but we need to continue to make the case for increased investments. So why do we need more? Current public investments still leave a huge gap between what parents can afford and the actual cost of providing high-quality child care. And then here's the final piece, which is a sample core ask or call to action for our target audiences that acknowledges the current investments. And it's really important here, especially to make it we don't want to make it seem like we're starting from scratch. And as that makes the issue of expanding access to child care really seem almost impossible to solve, which will cause audiences, particularly policymakers, to tune out. So we really want to stress that this is building on progress, but it continues to be much needed. So now we're going to go into several reasons why funding for CCDBG should increase. In other words, why should policymakers, particularly members of Congress, care? So this again is where we'll lean into the message research, and all of these reasons for supporting increased federal funding for child care can be better articulated through stories, which, as you guys all know, we are relying on you and working with you to help collect to really illustrate why CCDB is so important. And so here you'll see high-quality child care boosts brain development. We already discussed this. Another key piece, and it's very much largely based on the conversations we've all had about what's been resonating in your states, is that it strengthens today's workforce, including the child care workforce in particular. This is where we include some data points on how much money how much money is lost annually due to a lack of affordable and accessible care. So that gets to that immediate economic need that's important to include. And then we also highlight salaries of child care providers. So those who are caring for children during the most important time in their development. Again, that's leaning into the research from specifically from Zaentz that really showed that people were pretty, regardless of political affiliation, were disheartened and seemed surprised even when they found out how little child care workers themselves were making. So here we also go into, I think these are more like 101 kind of 101 types, but if we're talking about and trying to position CCDBG as the solution here in the narrative, we need to explain what it does. And again, this is just a higher level way for you guys to potentially use to start off a story about CCDBG and then add in some specific points about what you guys are doing. But so we've made the case hypothetically for CCDBG. But what does it do? How can we continue to position it as a solution to supporting a productive workforce of today and tomorrow? And CCDBG looks completely different in each state. We're learning that more and more. But hopefully this is something that can help describe the program more broadly and then creates an entree to go into the more specifics of what your state has done with the increased CCDBG funds, and if you want to even think aspirationally, what more could be done with additional funding. So it supports multiple strategies to improve the quality of child care programs and helps families actually access these programs. It provides families with help to afford the basic need of child care, and it positions child care providers with the needed wages, training, education, and resources to deliver the type of high-quality early childhood experiences that kids need to have that foundation for healthy development and learning and behavior through life. It also expands the availability of high-quality care for families. So again, this is at a high level describing kind of as a whole what states have been doing with CCDBG funding. So here you'll see a more in-depth description of CCDBG, yet it's still short and concise. And you'll notice how we focus here on how CCDBG helps families afford care and ensure children are safe. We emphasize the safety piece here because we heard in a lot of our conversations with you all that funding was used for background checks. That is not necessarily the most compelling piece of CCDBG. It's very important, obviously, but I think a lot of folks will assume those things were already happening. So I think positioning that, really being intentional and mentioning safe, and can learn and develop, which ties into the core values on the importance of the early years. And then what does CCDBG do? This is very intentional. We want to position childcare as a basic need. This really isn't something that just high or low income families need. The reality of today's workforce, combined with the realities of what parents with young children face, makes childcare really a basic need. It also shows that there's still work to be done, and also because we specifically mentioned the work that states have done, really putting states in the driver's seat for funding. So yes, maybe the funding is coming from a federal investment, but states are really deciding how that funding is being used, which is another kind of message and thread that resonates more with conservative audiences. So right now, CCDBG is highly underfunded, and less than 1 in 6 children are eligible for federal assistance receive it. Again, reinforcing our core call to action. More federal investments will help states reach children and families in need of high quality and reliable and affordable care. And then since we know much of the impacts to date are particularly felt by child care providers, we decided to go a little deeper on this piece. So it's really important to explain the challenges that child care workers face and how CCDBG has helped them. In particular, the research, again, from the Bipartisan Policy Center showed that policymakers on both sides of the political aisle were really particularly moved when they learned that more than half of child care providers rely on some form of public assistance. So we recommend building that into your narrative, especially if your state did focus on really supporting, finding new ways to use CCDBG funds to support providers. And it's also critical to connect child care providers with the messaging on the formative development that takes place in the early years. So really repositioning child care providers as really playing a huge role in the development because of children, because of everything we know about the brain science and human development. And then here, it expands the availability of high quality and affordable care. Again, these were key issues. It positions child care as a solution that addresses issues around cost, access, and quality. It's also a place that you can highlight the need for targeted investments that really support low-income families who may work non-traditional hours, which we know has been a focus for a lot of you on the phone. And then moving on here, here are just some sample calls to action. It's important to be really specific here so that whoever you're talking to can walk away from a story with a sense that they can do something to address all the challenges that we discussed. Since policymakers are people too, I know it's easy to forget that sometimes, but psychology really shows us that people want to feel good about something they do or something that they can do or something that they did. So for policymakers, we want to make them feel good about what they've achieved and that they've had the opportunity to build on this progress. I think it was really interesting, especially as we watched kind of the news coverage of CCDBG, especially at the beginning of this year. We saw a lot of governors in particular from more conservative states who were taking credit for CCDBG, even though it was federal funding and probably something that they might have not normally supported. But it was something that they could feel good about, they know constituents care about, and we want to make them understand that this is something that they can continue to take ownership of, and something that can really drive results in their state and their communities. And so here you'll see also for advocates, we want to talk about the value of child care, especially as it pertains to the workforce, And for families, we want them to influence lawmakers. We want them to tell their stories about how it's impacted their lives and their children's, again, linking two universal values, that it supports parents at a time when they're stretched and that they may need extra support to work, a time when they need extra support to work, go to school, and when their child's brain is developing faster than at any other point in their life. And so here you'll see a diagram showing how to use the core message framework. So this is where you need to go beyond simply sharing these messages to telling a story with a beginning, middle, and an end. So again, you start from a place of agreement, talking about maybe it's affordability issues, the brain science, or the common experience that parents of young children feel. Then you highlight your local challenge or problem. What are you in your state specifically trying to solve? What is your policy target concerned with? What is your member of Congress most concerned with? Are they focused on ensuring parents can stay in the workforce? Are they concerned about substance abuse, about attracting workers to the state? You want to offer CCDBG as a solution to this clearly established need. And then you want to provide proof points. So this is where you can draw from the established research, some of the stats that we even included in the core messaging. But you also need to invoke emotion with intention. And so you want to create and collect stories. That's what we're helping you guys do, and we are excited to continue working with you on it. So really create and collect stories about how CCDBG is working in communities. You want to collect quantifiable impacts, and Patricia will talk through an approach that worked well in Kentucky, as well as those provider and family testimonials. And of course, we want you to share any of those with us, or help us make the connection so that we can collect those stories. I think it's really important to remember it's not enough to rattle off stats. So like, for example, I could literally sit here and name and rattle off about several stats about how many children are uninsured or underinsured in this country, or I could share a story about the experience of a family with, let's say, a chronically ill child, and I can guarantee you that you're going to remember that story about the child rather than all the data points that I laid out. So our hope is that you can use parts of the messaging presented today as an overarching story arc, pair it with stories illustrating how CCDBG is impacting not only systems or funding, but particularly people in your state, to encourage policymakers to prioritize and continue to prioritize federal funding for child care. And with that, I am pleased to introduce Patricia Tennen. She's as Deb mentioned, the Chief Officer of Strategic Initiatives at Kentucky Youth Advocates, she's going to talk a bit more about communications techniques that she's been using to capture the proof points we just talked about, and other successful communication strategies that are working in Kentucky.
Great, thank
you.
I'll
hand it over to you, Patricia.
Okay, thanks, Rachel. Hi, everyone. So maybe I'll start off with a little bit of context about Kentucky Youth Advocates and what we've been doing in regard to child care over the years. So we have really, especially starting in 2013, we had a huge budget shortfall, and it just bottomed out our child care system. So there was a freeze on our program, and we had our eligibility was severely cut to 100% of the federal poverty level, which was the lowest in the country, and it dropped from serving about 44,000 children down to 17,000 at the low. So it really suffered a big blow that year, and I think the silver lining was that it helped our early childhood advocates, who often you all might have experienced were really jostling between preschool and Head Start, and there was kind of differing opinions, and often it felt like childcare was getting left out. Well, it was hard to deny that that was the system that everybody needed to be advocating for and funding for. And so we were successful. After that year, we went to our state legislators and made the case that this is not okay, this is a crisis, and we need some state funds. And they put $42 million in of state general funds to lift the freeze and restore the eligibility. But we have our eyes on the prize. Our long-term goal is we want eligibility to be at 200% of the federal poverty level, because that's what research tells us families need to make ends meet. And so the timing with these increased CCDBG funds worked well for us because we have a state budget every 2 years, and so we were in the middle of advocating to try to get increases once again, and then we were really making the case that we've been hearing from our provider communities that our reimbursement rates were just too low to support the quality of care that we want for the kids in Kentucky. And so we also had a kind of a list of, we had worked with our partners, advocacy partners, to develop kind of the case for why increased state investments were needed. And so then when in March, when the federal allocation came through, it was just when our budget session was ending. And so it was perfect timing to go to our state leaders and say, here's how you need to spend that additional $42 million that's coming in. And so they were able to enact a lot of the things that we recommended that coming fall in November. And so the ways that they utilized it, one was to raise provider reimbursement rates to the 40th percentile of market rates, not as high as we wanted. We were advocating for 75th, but in addition to that, they were able to do some things that we were really excited about, including raising the exit eligibility. So entrance eligibility is at 160, and now families can stay on until 200% of federal poverty level, which we're really excited about. That's going to address the cliff effect that we had been hearing had been impacting families. We're also removing a 20-hour work requirement that we had for parents enrolled in post-secondary education and training. So we were previously requiring young parents to go to school full-time and work 20 hours in addition to that parenting, which didn't make any sense. So we were able to remove that, also to cover the cost of the background checks for providers, and it's also going to be used to support child care for children in foster care, which is at an all-time high right now here too. So that was, I think that was the context. That's kind of what how Kentucky chose to spend the money. And just to give you when Rachel was talking about the audience and kind of their core values, Kentucky has recently become a red state, I think officially in 2016. We had, we're on a webinar. Sorry. Okay. Sorry about that. So we are, we've got, I'm sorry, our executive director just popped in here. So we know that the big value here is on work. There's a lot of talk about the dignity of work and how the economy's been improving, and we hear that there are, places in this state where there are jobs that people can't get filled because for various reasons. And so, we really wanted to tap into that value of and lift up. We see this as an opportunity to lift up childcare as the one of the barriers that keep people from working, because we know anyone who has had to pay for childcare as a parent knows it's incredibly expensive. Even me, I had 2 young daughters in childcare, and that payment was more than our mortgage. That was the biggest expense we had. And so we know that that's the message that's going to resonate, I think, with our policymakers here in Kentucky, just lifting up the connection to work. And we think there's real room, in addition. It's not a partisan issue at all. I think there's a lot of space to have that, to build support for childcare. And so what we've been doing with this new funding is, one, making sure that everyone knows about it, and especially our congressional delegation. So we are conducting thank you tours of for all 8 of our federal delegates where we actually want them to go visit a child care center, so where they can hear from us the stories, connecting it to work. But I think then seeing the children and in the settings that they are, I hope we'll have those opportunities to talk about the importance of brain development and the science there. But in order to build up to that, we also wanted to make sure that we're collecting those stories and impact, those proof points that Rachel mentioned, and then communicating to them. So this past March, we had, the rate increases had been in effect for about 4 months, but we went ahead and sent a survey, created a survey through SurveyMonkey that we issued to using the help of all of our child care provider and other advocates. And we got a pretty decent response. Over a 2-year period, we heard from 127 providers from 43 counties in Kentucky. We made sure to ask them, how many children they served, how many of them participated in the child care assistance program, and then ask them specifically, on a scale of 1 to 5, whether they had been able to, how they used the increased funds, essentially. Another value we know is small businesses, and so we found through that process initially that the biggest response was that 65% of them said that the increased funds simply helped them stay in business. It helped them overcome risk of closure. We heard from 46% that they were able to retain staff, and then about 25% were able to raise staff wages, while others, 29% of them said that they hope to in the near future. We heard that many of them were giving staff more hours and hiring more staff. And so we have created a visual report then that we issued a press release, pitched it to the media, and we've since then been getting some really great stories based on this then that we can share with our congressional delegates. The other great timing is 2019 is a governor's race for us, and it's also building up to our 2020 state budget session. And so, in addition to this survey being and the results being a good tool to share with our congressional delegates as a thank you, the way we're framing it is thank you, this federal investment in child care is making an impact. But gaps remain. We still have, we need more we need more public investments to build on this progress. And so we'll be able to use this with both audiences, with our federal delegation and then our state legislators as well. And then the other great thing with this tool, we are planning to follow up in 6 months and see if there's been even further impacts, which we would expect after it's been in place longer. But we also asked them if they'd be willing to be interviewed or participate in a focus group. And I think 68 of them responded that they would be interested. And so now we have a nice list that we were able to go through to identify, folks that had done interesting things with the funding. We can, do a cross-section of our urban and rural providers, and then we are now ready. We're going to be working with Rachel to vet those stories and figure out which ones would be particularly useful and think about how we could use them moving on. So I think I will pause there, and I think
Great.
Yeah.
So thank you. I think we're going to turn to questions now. I am going to put up the last slide in the presentation so that anyone who wants to be in touch with Rachel afterwards knows how to reach her. And I want to remind you now that the way to put a question in the system is to type it in the participant feedback box and make sure that you send your question to either me or to all the co-presenters, and then depending on what the question is, we'll direct it to Rachel or to Patricia. Rachel, I thought I might follow up a little bit with one of the last things actually that Patricia said, which was sorting through the stories and figuring out, which ones to use and how to shape them. I wondered if you wanted to comment a little bit on that.
Sure. I think how we're working on this with Patricia and how we're working on story collection with each state is definitely very different, and that's okay and totally fine. I think with in Kentucky, because Patricia already had the survey data, so she shared that raw data with us, and what we were looking for were we developed some kind of key criteria, because we can't obviously interview everybody, but we were looking at we were looking for folks who kind of spoke to some key things and key ideas we wanted to reinforce. So we were looking at folks. There was, first of all, for some geographic diversity around the state, so urban and rural. We also were looking because one of our key questions that we asked Patricia, and we've asked everybody who we've had the opportunity to have one-on-one conversations with so far, was where you thought the greatest impact was in terms of how you guys use the CCDBG dollars. So, Patricia had told us that the eligibility requirements really had an impact on a lot of families who were able to continue to receive the benefit while they could continue to work and or go to school. So we were looking for providers who mentioned specifically that they served a lot of parents who were who because they could access it now, were able to go to school or go to school or continue their jobs because we are relying on the providers to really kind of connect us to family stories, which we're, I think, all about a couple of steps removed from generally. We also wanted to see folks who were just serving a lot of families on public who were receiving the benefit. So we weren't. So at least we were want to talk to providers who at least have served about half of their children and families are receiving that benefit. And then we were also just looking for some mentions of some interesting things that people did, providers specifically did with the funding that really kind of spoke to a theme of enhancing quality, knowing that enhancing quality and enhancing affordability, knowing that those are kind of two key issues that policymakers are concerned with. And so, for instance, there was one provider who talked about how they were able to integrate a lot more family engagement activities into their curriculum and into their program thanks to the CCDBG dollars. So that was something that why we chose that particular provider to vet and to potentially move forward with through a story. But I think, Patricia, maybe we can share like a sample of the questionnaire that you did when we share the follow-up materials. I just thought the questionnaire that you guys put together was so helpful in terms of helping to lead us to those kinds of stories that would be most compelling. And we really do our goal is to really tie it back to a particular theme in each state. So and that kind of core value. So like Patricia said, the workforce piece. How can the stories that we collect really build towards and serve as that proof point for that key theme? In someplace else, let's say in Texas, we know that a lot of the funding has contributed to quality pieces and QRS. So we're going through. They also have a survey that we're going through and looking for providers that were able to maybe participate in the QRS or got higher star ratings because of the CCDBG dollars. But again, kind of speaking to that overall value and kind of what and to tell to really tell a story about a particular state.
That's great. And Patricia, if you can send me your survey, we can send it out with the slides and the recording, which I would really appreciate.
I'll send that, and also along with kind of the summary that we then created from the survey.
I wonder also if you could comment a little bit about the cost, both in dollars and staff time, of doing that, just to give people a sense of how what it takes to replicate what you did.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we had, we have a SurveyMonkey account, which is a lot. And so I think in terms of staff time, I'd estimate putting that together, our staff member who was able to put that together and get it ready to go, I'd say that was, in a day. And then her analysis, of course, then on the back end would probably be another couple days of time. And then, of course, the time that our communications director, Mara, has put into then pitching it and taking, disseminating the results, of course, that takes time. We were also fortunate that we have someone on staff that can design it, so we did all of the report design in-house. And so, yeah, I'm not sure about the dollar amount. I think it's certainly, we've invested some time in it, but we think it's a great opportunity. We'd heard from, one field representative in a district where we were arranging the tour that she's been doing it for 20 years, and this is the first time that she'd heard from a child care center, and she was not familiar with the child care assistance program. So that tells us that this is needed and worthwhile.
Great. We have a question from Ian, which is, what if you don't have any impact stories from CCDBG to collect? What should we focus our communications efforts on in that case?
Yeah, so I can start with this one. I think that I think there's two things here. So if you don't have necessarily the impact stories, and I know, some states are, especially let's say you're a state that hasn't allocated your CCDBG funds yet. So I think if that's the case, then your communications efforts should focus on really making sure you're using communications opportunities to talk about what you want those funds to be used for, where you know that you'll have the greatest impact, and that involves translating your policy agenda into communications and into storytelling and into compelling materials on that front. And then also I think you can really think aspirationally. So I think there's opportunities to talk about, if, kind of in a more hypothetical way, but if we were able to get this funding, if there's a way to do cost modeling, this more, X number of families would be served, or if you can even pair it with a story that maybe you have about a provider who might be struggling, or a family, or maybe you pair your aspirational goals with issues around child care deserts, and that's data that's readily available from CAP. The Urban Institute also came out with a report in the last couple of days that actually looked at if they changed the eligibility requirements to 150% of the federal poverty line, how many more people would be able to access child care subsidies in each state, and then also how many more women in particular would be able to be in the workforce. And so saying, highlighting those kinds of data points and then pairing it with what your aspirational goals are. So I think even if you're not, and then of course, if you don't have the stories yet, or you haven't started to collect the stories, I think really taking Patricia's approach to heart and what Kentucky's done, starting with a survey, which we're also happy to help you develop if you haven't done that yet, and then distributing it. I think the best way probably is through networks of providers. Maybe it's your state NACI chapter or state NACI affiliate, or other kind of child care networks that help you reach providers, and then including questions on there about the families that are being served, so that maybe those providers can also connect you with some families. But we're here to help, so we're hoping that this kind of conversation helps to spur some thinking if you don't have any stories collected yet. So
I really need to point out here that the partnership is very fortunate in that we're doing this project jointly with CLASP and the National Women's Law Center. And so I want to lift up two things. One is CLASP actually has already produced the numbers of kids that could be served if we get the new increased funding that Congress is currently considering state by state. And she has just sent around the link, which we will send around after the webinar as well. Actually, Christine, if you could send that to me in my email, that would be great. And the other thing I wanted to say is just that National Women's Law Center and CLASP are both phenomenal resources for this kind of work in general. and they're available to help you think through how to make your case and what data is available, and they really know their stuff. So if you're trying to figure out another way to show your impact or to frame the potential impact, feel free to email me, and I will put you in touch with whichever one of the two is more likely to be able to help you on that particular topic. But one of the great things about this project is that our three organizations together are able to really give you guys support as you do your work, and I want to lift that up. Do we have any more questions? If not, I'm going to thank both Rachel and Patricia. Do either of you have any last thoughts before we log off? Oh, we have one more question, but first, why don't we do that question first, and then I'll ask you that. One question is, how do you advocate for child care without pitting child care against pre-K, which, of course, is a particularly compelling question because so many states have worked for so many years on universal pre-K efforts.
Yeah, this is a common issue I think that a lot of states are facing just because they have done, and there's just tremendous work and progress on the pre-K front, especially in the last decade, and so we would never want to jeopardize any of that work. I think it's really important to really connect the two, and so talking about how investments early on in programs like child care help to lay the groundwork and maximize maximize investments in preschool, pre-K, K-12, post-secondary, and kind of really talking about it's a continuum. I think a lot of people frame it in the terms of birth to 5, and I think you can do that by emphasizing the brain science on the earliest years and the importance of childcare, but obviously also talking about how it connects to ensuring kids are ready for preschool and and that's all those investments that states have made in pre-K and preschool, which are absolutely critical, are the most effective that they can be by putting forward that upfront investment and that down payment almost of sorts.
Great. Patricia, is that an issue you've confronted in Kentucky?
Yeah, I think for sure we have, and it's a hard one. I think Rachel's suggestions were really good. I think we've been also, trying to lift up the collaborative models, and that's a policy area too, where we have grants now that support those collaboration between our public preschool and child care. But I think also lifting up that it's really the 0 to 3, the infants and toddlers. There's a huge gap there that pre-K isn't serving, and that's why we also need to be investing in child care as well.
Great. So I want to thank you both and give you both a moment to say any final words for our audience if you have them, and then we'll close it for today. But this recording will be online and shared with everybody along with the slides, and so you'll be able to refer back to it or to reach out to me or to Rachel or to Patricia. Rachel, is there any final words you want to share?
Just, we're excited. I think we've done one-on-one calls with almost every state so far. So I know that I've been following up with folks, but also feel free to reach out to me anytime. We recognize that every state is in a different place, and we just want to be supportive and help to collect a good variety of stories that demonstrate CCDBG impact, wherever your state may be in the process. So just please don't hesitate to ever give me a call, and even if you're or email, even if you're at an event and you just happen to hear a great provider, just shoot me a quick note, and we can go from there. And nothing has to be packaged or fancy, as Patricia can attest. We're happy to go through documents and do that kind of vetting and story mining piece that we know can be time intensive, and we're hoping to help add some capacity to your organization.
Thanks. And Patricia?
Yeah, I just want to say the survey that we send and the other materials, please feel free to use it, and we don't want to recreate the wheel, so it's all there for you to use your own. And I wanted to just thanks to Deb and Rachel and Christine for, this is exciting to have kind of all the support and the resources to advocate for childcare. So thanks for making it happen, you all.
Well, thank you for being willing to share. I always say that the partnership's motto should be steal from your friends with permission. So thank you for giving them permission.
Permission grant.
Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing how well you can use this fabulous information. I'm going to end the recording now.
Right.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Thank you. Please stand by.